So today I'm going to be talking about the successful and the neglectful. I'm going to start with a story. In 1941, during World War II, the British military were facing a dilemma. They were losing so many bomber planes during their missions over Europe, and the ones returning from those missions were riddled with bullet holes. The military needed to do something about this. So they decided to add armor on these planes to increase their chances of survival. So what they did was, they did a damage analysis on the planes that had come back to see where they were taking damage, where they were getting hit. And they took this data and they sent them to their team of mathematicians from the Statistical Research Group, the SRG. This group was led by a brilliant mathematician named Abraham Wald. It was their job to decide where that armor should go on the planes. So Abraham and his team decided to compare all the data from the planes, all the bullet holes, and plot it out in a diagram similar to this. These are all the bullet holes that are collectively being collected on all the planes that have come back. And as you can see, from what they've realized, is a lot of the damage was concentrated on three areas: the wings, center, and tail of the planes. So this made it very clear to them where they had to add the armor on the planes, which were in these areas, since they were getting the most hit. And this information helped them realize where they had to add the reinforcement to protect the planes, to protect more planes so that they wouldn't crash, to protect them. And it was thanks to this information from the planes that returned back successfully. These pilots that went to a difficult war and back gave these mathematicians and engineers the insight they needed and information they needed to make the better decision for all the planes ahead of them. They gave them insight and they learned from them. And just like us, we also try to learn from those who made it, those who succeeded. In our everyday lives, there are always those who shine a light for us, those successful people that emit this light that we can follow, that we can pursue into our own path of success. We can look at their characteristics or traits and try to create a pattern that we ourselves can follow that can work for us in our everyday life. And we've been doing this for a very long time. Whether you want to be a successful, prosperous entrepreneur like Jeff Bezos or a legendary athlete like Usain Bolt, we each have our own image of success that we like to follow, that we pursue. And these people like these make it more clear for us on where we should go exactly. They make it easier for us. For example, these businesses right here are a huge inspiration to a lot of entrepreneurs, new and old. Books have been written about their stories, and interviews have been done on their traits, their characteristics, their strategies, their amazing and unique traits that led them to this major success. And a lot of entrepreneurs and upcoming business people want to learn from these people. They want to gain the knowledge that they used in their past career to make it this far. And we do the same thing with ours. Just like the mathematicians who looked at the planes coming back, they got that information. They got that necessary knowledge they needed to know where to move forward, where to take the next step. How many people here have some person or some group that have succeeded that you like to follow, that you try to learn from? How many people here? Right? We all have that image in our head, some figure that we want to follow, that we want to learn from so we can become more like them. And we try to follow their patterns and traits and all of that. This is what we do, and this is what the mathematicians did in World War II with the planes. And that's amazing to have that kind of person. But Abraham Wald, the leader of the Statistical Research Group, would have disagreed with all of you. See, when the mathematicians were so focused on the planes that were coming back, they overlooked one important detail, and that's something that Abraham Wald caught himself. He suggested that they shouldn't put the armor in the areas with the most bullet holes. No. He said they should put the armor where there were no bullet holes, where there was no damage, zero. And they thought he was insane, which is fine. It's fair. But what they didn't realize is that what he said is that there actually were bullet holes. The planes were getting shot in these areas, just not the ones they saw coming back to base. See, the mistake that the mathematicians were making, that Abraham Wald happened to notice, was that all their information at hand, all their decisions, all the data that they had with them, were all based on the planes that made it back home. Or in other words, the planes that survived, that were successful to come home. And they overlooked the hundreds of other planes that didn't. And see, this led to an error in their thinking. They were so focused on only a small sample of planes that were right in front of them that they completely forgot about the ones that didn't make back, the ones that took damage they couldn't see. And these planes couldn't be there. They couldn't be at the base. They couldn't have their damage analyzed. They couldn't have their bullet holes seen. And so the mathematicians didn't factor that into their analysis. They didn't factor that into their calculations. They didn't think about them. These non-surviving planes were overshadowed by the surviving planes. And that led to a great mistake, almost led to a great mistake, until Abraham Wald noticed this. See, Abraham Wald, when he realized this error, he came to two conclusions. Either German bullets coincidentally hit these planes on these specific spots, the wing, center, and tail, except for the untouched areas. Out of 100 planes, they were all left untouched on the engine and near the tail. They were all untouched. Possible. Or the planes that didn't come back were hit somewhere they couldn't return from. They were hit somewhere that was fatal. And that was the untouched areas. See, the mathematicians were so focused on these particular planes because they survived from battle, and they completely neglected the planes that hadn't come back, and that sort of led to an error in their thinking. An error in thinking that is referred to in psychology as survivorship bias. Now, survivorship bias, by definition, is the logical error of only focusing on the people or things that have passed some process while overlooking all those that did not. So that means you could only see the winners and not the losers. Sometimes you can only see the successful and not the unsuccessful. And sometimes you can only see the planes that survived and not those who didn't. And you'd wonder if they were about to make a mistake, such a small mistake in a line of work where small mistake costs lives, then it makes you think, are we doing the same thing? Are we doing the same thing in our everyday lives? And to answer that, yes, we are. We're doing this not just to ourselves, we do this in business, we do this in history, we do this even in relationships. For example, when you're trying to look for advice on your relationship, naturally you'd seek it from those with a perfect one. If you want advice about your marriage, you'd go for people who seem to have an amazing, perfect marriage, rather than those who have been bitterly divorced. You wouldn't really consider them because they were divorced. But what you might not realize is that the divorced themselves might be able to tell you something important, something you shouldn't do with your partner or relationship. They have essentially important information that you won't be able to hear. And this example also goes to business and the companies I spoke of. See, these are some of the major companies in our modern time today. But if you were to go back to just when they made that major decision that led to their amazing success, that major decision that caused them to explode into the amazing conglomerates all these are, and ask them if they were sure where this decision would take them, none of them would know. None of them would be confidently tell you that we knew where this decision would take us. They didn't know. They weren't sure. Because at the time, it was just another decision. They didn't know that it would even reach this level of magnitude of success that it has today. And that puts things into perspective, because the other businesses at the same time, who had the same level of expertise, same level of perseverance, same level as these companies, also made major decisions. And from these a lot of companies, only the very few we see today are the ones that have actually made it, because we can see them and we know they're the ones who made it. And the companies that made the companies around the same time that also made that major decision, but failed, but went bankrupt, they failed. They were gone, and along with them, so was all their business experience, their knowledge, their information, all that. That goes with them because they're forgotten. And we're left with only these very few survivors. And we can only hear from what they have to say, from a small sample of advice of these businesses, from hundreds or thousands of them that have failed. Had any one of these companies taken a hit they couldn't come back from, and which some of them almost did, some of them were very close to bankruptcy, they were close to failure. And had they taken a hit they couldn't come back from, then you probably would have never heard of names like Apple or Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos. And that's exactly what happened to those companies that are gone. Something interesting I noticed when I was looking for people that failed on Google, naturally. You usually get something like 15 highly successful people that have failed before reaching major success. Top famous people and companies that have failed really bad before they made it big. Something about success. It's usually the same thing. And this goes on for 8 pages. It's just success. You can't really find just blatant failure stories. You just can't find those kind of things because people aren't usually interested in knowing about how they failed. The media doesn't seek advice or doesn't try to interview the companies who failed. They don't ask them for their top 10 secrets for success because they didn't succeed, so what's the point? So they just overlook them and they just move along and focus the spotlight on those that did succeed, those that did survive. And those are the only ones that we get to see. A very small view from a very large window. And this is a problem because why this happens is because failure in our society is not seen as something to be proud of or embraced. It's not something you want to show the world and tell them, hey, I'm a failure. So we tend to hide these things. We tend to mute them, and they get overshadowed by the successful ones because they're the ones who are usually in the spotlight. And why this is a problem is because you don't get to see the whole picture of success. You only get to see a small part of it. In a book called Fooled by Randomness that was written by Nicholas Taleb, he said, and he described survivorship bias in an interesting way. He said that for every person with a certain quality who has ended up with great success, there are many others with the same quality that didn't. So what he means that if you were to only take a look at a certain group of people, you wouldn't really get a definite answer to their success. Even if they'd like to think so, you might overlook other factors that led to their success, something they might not realize, like chance, coincidence, or timing. So we only get to see a small part of their success. We don't get to see the whole thing because the whole thing includes the failures, and we don't often see those. Just like the planes. They crashed, so we never got to see what happened to them. We never got to see where they got hit. And he also says that if we look too much at success stories that made it by chance or coincidence, we might confuse sufficient qualities with necessary qualities to success. Because what led them to their success was sufficient. They might have taken hits, or they might have made decisions that allowed them to survive a little longer. Just like the planes. They took hits that weren't fatal to them. They took hits that they could get hit and still make it back to base, no problem. But the other planes, not so much. They took a hit somewhere that they couldn't come back from. And those were the unlucky ones. And so that's why we might confuse necessary aspects of someone's success with sufficient qualities. We might think that because they're successful and they do this on a daily basis, that's a correlation, so therefore that's a connection, correlation, causation. No. So a lot of kids try in this world who love football aim to be like Lionel Messi. All right? They work really hard every day so that they can be like him. Sorry. And only a couple of them would continue to pursue that goal to become professional football players. Let's say 100,000 of these kids continue pursuing their goal, continue training. And from these hundreds of thousands of kids, they work really hard, and they all with the same rigorous passion and all that for football to become the best. They all work really hard, they all join clubs, they all train, they all do that sorts, so that they can be the next whatever professional football player. This comes back to a philosophy that Nassib talks in his book. He says that there are two critical ways to look at someone's profession through the lens of survivorship bias. The first one is the number of people involved in it, the number of people involved in that profession, the volume. And second is the randomness content of his profession. How much does chance play a part in what they do? So we have 100,000 kids who all enter this very intense field of football, professional football, each of them with the same passion and heart to become the best. So from that volume, by chance, a handful of them will succeed. They will get to make it. They will be able to reach their goal. But not necessarily because they were the best of the 100,000 participants, no. But because the rest could have possibly not made it for whatever other reasons, whether it was injury, education, life got in the way. And we never get to hear from what happened to those kids. We don't know we never get to hear their story. We only get to hear from the very select few that did happen to succeed. And that's not because they were the best of the 100,000, or they were the most passionate or the most dedicated, no. It's just because they happened to make it past that certain process. And this thinking is pretty normal, not just outside of football. He says that, Talib says that if you have a large number of people all aiming to achieve one thing, all right, a large number of people trying to achieve something, and that something has a bit of chance involved, he says a few of the participants will achieve success by chance, statistically speaking. A few of them will achieve success. But again, not because they were the best of the selected ones or whatever, but because they just happened to make it. And this sentence that he says in his book, moderate success involves hard work and skill with some chance. But he also said that extreme success, like people such as Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, the really top of the top, their level of success involves a little bit more effort and work. But also, it depends a lot on chance. Not everyone can reach that unbelievable level of success that they have. Not everyone can do it. And so, one thing that we can draw from survivorship bias, one thing that we can learn from this kind of thing, is that learning from those who failed can help us avoid the same mistakes that they made. It'll reduce our chances of failing because we'll know what not to do. But learning from those who succeed can be useful, but does not necessarily guarantee the same outcome for you. Because the circumstances that worked for their amazing success won't necessarily work the same with you. And so that's why we have to keep in mind that some certain advice from successful people might only be taken through the lens of survivorship bias, might only be taken because they think that this is what led them to their success because they have succeeded. Because they did this and they succeeded, this is what you should do to succeed. When someone tells you to follow your passion because it worked for them, it'll also work for you, it's a bit risky to trust that kind of advice, to trust the advice of trust the advice purely on those who succeeded, especially those who are very successful. And one thing we have to keep in mind is that success and failure are two sides of the same coin. Success and failure are two important factors of the whole picture. So instead of looking at one part, you have to look at the whole things to have a better view, to have a clear view on things. And that's why, if you do this, if you take a look at both sides of the coin, if you take a look at the successful and also the failure, and consider them into your thinking, into your calculations, then like Abraham Wald, who saved hundreds of lives and ultimately changed the tide of the war, you could also make better decisions in your life heading towards your way of success. So I want everyone in this room to look at the people or things that have succeeded, that you follow because they are successful because they're succeeding. I want you to look at these things and ask yourselves, am I missing something? Do this, and the reason behind your success could very well be within the story of someone who failed. Thank you.